Every day, millions of people wake up to another headline. Trump says negotiations are progressing. Iran responds, oil prices fall, markets recover, the crisis may be ending. For most people, that sounds like good news. The war is over, the danger has passed, the world can move on. But history has a strange habit. It becomes most dangerous precisely when people begin believing the crisis has ended. History teaches us something uncomfortable. Wars rarely end when the shooting stops. They change form. The Second World War didn't begin with Pearl Harbor. The Cold War wasn't fought only with tanks. The collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't caused by one battle. The greatest geopolitical struggles are usually decided long after the headlines disappear. And that raises a far more important question. What if the real decision hasn't happened yet? What if everything we've watched over the past months was only the opening act? Because today, Donald Trump isn't deciding whether America should fight Iran. That decision has already been made in one form or another. The real question is much larger. How should America preserve its position in a world that is becoming increasingly difficult to control? That decision will influence far more than Iran. It will shape America's relationships with China, Russia, Europe, the Gulf states, Israel, global energy markets, artificial intelligence, supply chains, and perhaps even the future international order itself. To understand why, we have to stop thinking like journalists. We need to think like historians. Because history is rarely driven by personalities alone. It is driven by incentives. Empires don't wake up one morning and suddenly change direction. They respond to constraints, economic pressure, military realities, domestic politics, technological shifts, and above all, the incentives facing the people making decisions. Today, we're going to examine those incentives, not through ideology, not through partisan politics, not through wishful thinking, but through history, game theory, and strategic analysis. Because when we do that, something surprising begins to emerge. The biggest decision isn't whether America should negotiate. It isn't whether sanctions continue. It isn't whether military pressure increases. The biggest decision is much deeper. What kind of world is America trying to build after this crisis? And perhaps even more importantly, can it still build it? Why everyone is asking the wrong question. The public conversation usually sounds something like this. Will there be another strike? Will negotiations succeed? Will oil prices rise? Will Iran retaliate? These are understandable questions, but they're tactical questions. History remembers strategic decisions. Imagine asking someone in 1947, will there be another battle after World War II? That wasn't the important question. The important question was, what kind of world will emerge after the war? The institutions created after 1945 shaped decades of global politics. The Marshall Plan, NATO, the Bretton Woods financial system. None of those decisions were made because leaders wanted headlines. They were made because they understood that peace itself creates new strategic problems. Every great conflict eventually reaches this point. The battlefield becomes quieter. Diplomats become louder. Markets become optimistic. Television moves on. But behind closed doors, the truly important decisions begin. We're now entering that phase. People often assume negotiation means weakness. History suggests otherwise. Sometimes negotiations happen because both sides believe they can gain more by delaying confrontation. Sometimes they negotiate while preparing for future competition. Sometimes diplomacy becomes another battlefield. The Roman Republic understood this. So did Imperial Britain. So did the United States during the Cold War. Negotiation is rarely the opposite of competition. Very often, it is simply competition by different means, and that's why today's developments shouldn't automatically be interpreted as either peace or victory. Instead, they may represent something far more interesting, a transition from military confrontation to strategic competition. Game theory offers a useful way to think about this. Imagine two players sitting across from one another. Each has several options: escalate, negotiate, delay, signal strength, make concessions, threaten, cooperate. The important thing isn't which option appears strongest today. The important thing is which option creates the greatest advantage tomorrow. That is how long-term strategy works. The strongest move isn't always the loudest move. Sometimes restraint creates leverage. Sometimes patience creates opportunity. Sometimes waiting forces the other player into making costly mistakes. History repeatedly demonstrates this pattern, which raises another question. What incentives are shaping America's choices today? Because before we can understand Trump's biggest decision, we first need to understand the position America itself now occupies, and that position is very different from the one it occupied 20 years ago. Before we can understand Donald Trump's next decision, we need to ask a much bigger question. What choices does America actually have? This may sound obvious, but one of the most common mistakes in political analysis is assuming that leaders are free to do whatever they want. History suggests otherwise. The Roman emperors were constrained, British prime ministers were constrained, Soviet leaders were constrained. Even the most powerful rulers in history eventually discovered a simple truth. Power is never unlimited. Every leader operates inside a system. That system creates opportunities, but it also creates limits. And today, America's limits are becoming increasingly visible. The illusion of unlimited power. For nearly 3 decades after the Cold War, the United States occupied a position unlike any empire before it. Its navy controlled the world's oceans. Its currency dominated international trade. Its technology companies shaped global innovation. Its military projected power on every continent. Its financial system became the foundation of the global economy. Many people assumed this position would last indefinitely. History rarely works that way. Every dominant power eventually reaches a point where maintaining its position becomes more difficult than achieving it. Winning is one challenge. Staying on top is another. The Roman Empire discovered this after centuries of expansion. Britain faced the same dilemma after the First World War, not because they suddenly became weak, but because success creates new responsibilities. The larger your empire becomes, the more expensive it is to maintain. Every alliance must be supported, every trade route protected, every military commitment funded, every technological advantage defended. Eventually, even great powers begin asking an uncomfortable question. Can we continue doing everything we've been doing? The cost of global leadership. Think of the international system like an enormous business. Imagine a company that owns thousands of offices across the world. For years, profits are strong. Expansion is easy. Investors are confident. Then costs begin increasing. Employees demand higher wages. Competitors emerge. Supply chains become more complicated. Debt rises. New technologies require enormous investment. Suddenly, management faces difficult choices. Should it continue expanding? Should it cut costs? Should it focus only on its most profitable markets? Or should it fundamentally rethink its strategy? Countries face similar dilemmas, except the stakes are far greater, because mistakes are measured not only in money, but in decades. The return of great power competition. For many years, American foreign policy operated under a particular assumption. No country could seriously challenge the United States. That assumption no longer holds. Today's world looks very different. China has become an industrial powerhouse. Russia remains a significant military actor. Regional powers have become more confident. Technology has changed warfare. Artificial intelligence is transforming economic competition. Supply chains have become strategic assets. Energy routes matter once again. The competition is no longer confined to battlefields. It extends to semiconductor factories, rare earth minerals, data centers, shipping lanes, universities, financial systems, and even social media. This means the definition of national power has expanded. Military strength remains important, but it is no longer sufficient. Why Iran is about more than Iran? This brings us back to the Middle East. Many observers view Iran as an isolated issue, a regional conflict, a diplomatic problem. But strategy rarely works in isolation. Imagine a chessboard. You move one piece, but that move changes the position of every other piece. International politics works much the same way. Every decision regarding Iran sends signals elsewhere, to China, to Russia, to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, to Europe, to financial markets, to allies wondering whether American commitments remain reliable, to competitors looking for signs of hesitation or signs of overextension. This is why seemingly local conflicts often become global strategic tests. Not because every country wants war, but because every country is watching how decisions are made. The hidden cost of every decision. Suppose America increases pressure. What happens next? Perhaps deterrence strengthens. Perhaps negotiations gain leverage. Or perhaps new risks emerge elsewhere. Now imagine the opposite. Suppose America reduces pressure. Perhaps diplomacy succeeds. Perhaps tensions ease. Or perhaps rivals interpret restraint as an opportunity. Neither path guarantees success. Every option carries costs. This is where many political debates become overly simplistic. One side argues there is only one correct answer. History suggests there rarely is. Most leaders are choosing between imperfect options, not between perfect and imperfect ones. That distinction matters because strategy is often about managing trade-offs rather than achieving ideal outcomes. Why domestic politics cannot be ignored. Another common mistake is separating foreign policy from domestic politics. In reality, they are deeply connected. Every administration faces competing priorities: economic growth, inflation, employment, infrastructure, technology, border security, public opinion, Congress, international commitments. No president governs in a vacuum. Every foreign policy decision must also survive political reality at home. That doesn't mean domestic politics always determines international strategy, but it does mean the two cannot be separated. History repeatedly demonstrates that successful foreign policy often depends on maintaining domestic stability. When that balance weakens, strategic flexibility becomes more limited. The real strategic question, so perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along. The question isn't, will America negotiate or will America apply more pressure? Those are tactical decisions. The deeper question is this: how does the United States preserve long-term influence in a world that has become more competitive, more technologically complex, and more economically interconnected than at any point in modern history? That is a challenge every American administration now inherits, regardless of party, regardless of personality, regardless of campaign promises. And that is why Donald Trump's next decision matters. Not because one meeting or one negotiation will determine history, but because every decision sends a signal about how America intends to navigate a changing world. The headlines focus on today's events. History often judges the strategy behind them.